All of our New Testament readings today originate in roughly the same time period. While they speak of, and in the case of the epistle, claim to be written decades earlier, they are all written during the last couple decades of the first century. Jesus lived, died, and rose again over half a century earlier. Most, if not all, of the first-hand witnesses to the events of Jesus' life were dead. The temple and Jerusalem were smoldering ruins. And in the midst of this, the early Christian communities, Jewish and Gentile alike, were trying to figure out, where do we go from here? The expectation amongst Paul's earliest disciples had been that the earth and heavens were coming to an end. He had to admonish followers to get back to work living their lives, because some had taken up sitting and standing around waiting for the end of the world and expecting others to keep them fed and housed in the meantime. But by the time that today's readings were written, even Paul was dead, and yet the world still stood. Followers of the apostle Peter and the evangelists Luke and John took this moment to try to offer their insights as to what all of this meant and how to move forward in a time of unrealized expectations. Let me say, as much as I value and look to all of the Bible as being inspired by God, I also very much recognize the books of the Bible were written by people living in particular places and times, and that their prejudices and life experiences informed their writing. So while on the one hand, I find today's reading from the first letter of Peter to be a meaningful and a carefully considered theological treatise, I also recognize that the words the writer used elsewhere in the letter to try to comfort and offer solidarity to the women and enslaved fellow Christians of his own time have been abused throughout the centuries to deprive women and enslaved persons of their liberty and free will. That said, when read in the context of contemporaneous texts such as today's gospel and the reading from the Acts of the Apostles, we gain a different perspective, and the portion of the letter we read today becomes central to the writer's message. This world that God has made is good, but imperfect. In the midst of this imperfection, we, as followers of the way, the truth, of the life, will face conflict. We may not find ourselves, as Stephen did, subject to being stoned to death, but if we truly are followers of Christ, we will find ourselves at odds with the powers and temptations of this world. In the midst of this, we are called upon to be nonviolent, to resist the urge to return evil for evil, to create justification for violent suppression. But at the same time, we are called upon to live countercultural lives, follow Christ in his love for all, to act morally even when all around us choose immorality, to truly live in love, and to hold one another up when one is weak or about to fall. We are called by the writer of the first letter of Peter to become a new temple, a structure of living stones built upon the foundation of Christ and his death, life, and resurrection, of people who support one another and hold one another together across the ages and stand as a testament to Jesus as the Son of God. In other words, the writer of Peter calls us, no matter who we are and where we come from, to be the church in the world, in whatever temporal context we find ourselves. He calls us to be a community of believers, to stand in opposition to the evils and temptations of the world, but to do so together, not on our own, as in a one-on-one relationship with God. And this is where the church today, and we as the church today, seem to fall short the most, but also where our society in the 21st century in the United States falls short. Too often we describe our relationship with God in terms of a personal relationship to the Almighty, which is important, but we miss out on the need to share in this relationship with one another and to live out their spiritual relationship through our physical relationships with our companions in this world. Only the self-proclaimed Christian who claims their own personal Jesus and salvation, but does not see that salvation linked to the care and concern for others' physical, spiritual, and mental needs, or those who divorce themselves entirely from organized religion under the banner of being spiritual but not religious. Without a relationship with those around us, our relationship with God is little more than self-delusion. It is an expression of how the individualism, independence, and self-determination that so define our secular society has entered into our religious life as well. But when we look to the scriptures and to Jesus, the foundation of the church, we see that this viewpoint is at odds with our calling. We are called not just to follow Jesus, but to do so in community, in communion with one another. My life is connected to your life, like two stones in a wall are connected. Without one another, we are each weaker. We are more likely to fall. And without those who come afterward, have nothing to build upon. Without us, those who come afterward have nothing to build upon. Do not get me wrong. Each and every one of us is important and worthy of dignity and respect. But the importance that each of us has is as much about how we support one another as the strength that we have as individuals. Amen.